My name is Odette Flores. I am 31 years old. Last Friday night, I stood in the grand ballroom of the Keystone Hotel in downtown Philadelphia, wearing a tailored navy suit among a sea of sequined gowns and tuxedos. The room smelled of white lilies and roasted duck. Crystal champagne flutes clinked in rhythmic bursts of applause. My father, Richard, stood at the podium under a cascading chandelier, raising a toast to my stepbrother Julian. He called him the future of the Flores real estate empire, the new chief executive officer. I did not clap. I just watched. Then I felt the heat of someone standing too close. My stepmother, Sylvia, leaned in. She wore a silver silk dress that caught the ambient light like a mirror. Her voice barely rose above a polite whisper, perfectly calibrated to stay under the radar of the surrounding investors. "You do not belong here, Odette." I kept my eyes on the stage. "I was invited, Sylvia." The board sent the standard shareholder notice to my office. She smiled, a thin, tight line across her face. "Board notices are formalities for people who actually matter. You are just a bitter reminder of a dead woman." She lifted her right hand, signaling the perimeter. Two men in dark suits detached from the wall and stepped to either side of me. Security. "Remove her. She is trespassing." The music swelled from the string quartet in the corner. The guard on my left clamped his heavy hand onto my shoulder. His fingers dug through the wool fabric of my jacket, pressing hard against my collarbone. The grip was deliberate. It was meant to hurt. It was meant to make me flinch, to provoke the kind of hysterical scene Sylvia could use to justify this humiliation. Before I continue, welcome to Elena Vengeance. If you have ever watched someone try to erase you from your own family, you know exactly how this feels. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments right now. I read every single one. Now, let me tell you what happens when you throw a federal forensic auditor out of her own building. The guard shoved me forward toward the exit. I did not resist. I did not scream or demand my father look at me. Panic is a luxury I leave to amateurs. As they marched me past the ice sculptures and the velvet ropes, Julian caught my eye from the VIP table. He raised his glass to me. A smug grin spread across his face, secure in his new throne, confident he had finally won. Sylvia thought she had claimed the ultimate victory. She thought parading me out the service doors would cement Julianne's legacy and discard me for good. What Sylvia and Richard did not understand was the architecture of their own wealth. They did not own the marble floors we were walking on. My late mother bought the land beneath this hotel decades ago, and by having a uniformed guard physically force her only heir off the premises, Sylvia had just triggered a lethal morality clause in the ground lease. I adjusted my collar, stepped out into the crisp Pennsylvania autumn air, and reached into my pocket for my phone. The heavy brass doors of the Keystone Hotel shut behind me, severing the swell of the string quartet. The cold October wind swept off the Schuylkill River, biting through the thin wool of my tailored suit. Valets in red vests jogged past me, fetching German sports cars for early departures. I stood on the damp concrete, feeling the dull, throbbing ache where the guard had dug his fingers into my collarbone. It was a precise, calculated pain. Sylvia wanted me to feel physical submission to match the social exile. I smoothed the lapel of my jacket, took a slow breath of the crisp night air, and slipped my right hand into my coat pocket. My fingers traced the cold, textured metal of my late mother's vintage fountain pen. It was tarnished gold, heavy and unassuming. It lacked the shiny, ostentatious gloss of the limited edition Mont Blanc my father carried to sign cocktail napkins and golf club tabs. But my mother's pen held history. It held foresight. Richard loved to tell business magazines that he built his real estate empire from the ground up with his bare hands. He conveniently omitted whose ground he built it on. My mother, Elena, was not a socialite who cared about seating charts. She was a commercial real estate savant. 2 decades ago, she saw the potential in a blighted downtown Philadelphia block and bought the dirt. She let Richard secure the loans to build the glass towers. When her cancer metastasized during my sophomore year of college, she spent her final weeks sitting in a hospice bed, drafting a blind trust with a team of ruthless estate lawyers. She knew Richard's ambition. She predicted the new wife, the new heirs, and the inevitable attempt to erase her legacy. She leased the ground beneath the Keystone to Richard's management group for 99 years. But she laced the contract with a very specific, unbreakable poison pill. I pulled out my phone and dialed a Chicago area code. Harrison, my trust attorney, answered on the third ring. He sounded awake and sharp, typical for a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour to protect generational wealth. I am standing on the sidewalk outside the Keystone, I told him. My voice remained level, devoid of the panic Sylvia hoped to induce. Harrison paused. The silence on the line hummed with sudden, razor-sharp anticipation. Did they physically remove you, Odette? 2 uniformed guards, physical contact, directed verbally by Sylvia, witnessed by Julian, and at least a dozen high-net-worth guests near the coat check. I heard the distinct clatter of Harrison shifting his laptop closer on his desk. The keystrokes echoed through the receiver. The morality clause is triggered. Section 4, paragraph 2. If the primary heir of the landowner is barred, evicted, or forcefully denied entry to the premises, the ground lease enters immediate and uncurable default. File the injunction, I said. Harrison stopped typing for a fraction of a second. You realize the cascade this causes. All physical structures on the leased land forfeit to the landowner. The hotel, the fixtures, the operational epicenter of Richard's entire company reverts to your trust. The county clerk digital registry will accept the filing now, but the automated clearinghouses sweep at midnight. Once this hits the public record, there is no undoing it. File it, I repeated. I crossed the wet street, leaving the glowing marquee of the hotel behind me. I found an all-night diner on the corner of Market Street, slid into a cracked vinyl booth, and ordered a black coffee. The mug arrived thick and ceramic, radiating a comforting heat into my chilled palms. Through the rain-streaked window, I could still see the valet stand in the distance. The guests were inside that ballroom, raising crystal flutes to Julian, entirely oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring beneath their Italian leather shoes. The coffee was bitter, grounding my focus. I opened my secure federal auditing portal on my phone. Because I track white-collar assets and federal fraud for a living, I understand the intricate plumbing of corporate finance far better than Richard ever will. Richard's entire empire relies on an interconnected web of commercial credit lines. The Keystone Hotel is his crown jewel. It serves as the primary collateral holding up his operational debts. When Harrison registers the default deed transfer, algorithms at 3 different major banking institutions will flag the sudden loss of Richard's collateral. Modern artificial intelligence risk management protocols do not wait for human bankers to arrive on Monday morning. They act instantly to prevent capital flight. They will freeze the outgoing lines of credit to limit their own exposure. Richard was currently inside that ballroom, charging tens of thousands of dollars in premium catering, imported floral arrangements, and top-shelf liquor to corporate cards tied to an asset he no longer legally possessed. Sylvia made a fatal miscalculation. She believed power was defined by a VIP guest list. She thought wearing a silver silk dress and giving orders to hired muscle meant she controlled the board. She measured strength in optics. But true power is quiet. True power is a verified PDF filing entering a county clerk database at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. I set the tarnished gold pen on the Formica table. It reflected the harsh neon light of the diner sign outside. I remembered sitting beside my mother in her final days. Her skin was fragile, her voice barely a rasp, but her mind remained brilliant. She held my hand and told me that glass shatters, but dirt remains. She structured the blind trust to mature on my 30th birthday. Richard always assumed my inheritance was just a collection of index funds and a nominal deed. He never bothered to read the fine print of the default clause, because he never respected me enough to believe I would enforce it. My phone screen illuminated with a brief flash. A notification from the state registry dashboard showed a green check mark appearing next to a 12-digit filing number. A second later, Harrison sent me a text containing a single word: executed. The trap was sprung. The digital paperwork transitioned from a threat into a permanent legal reality. I left a $20 bill on the table, walked out of the diner, and hailed a passing cab. The leather seat of the taxi was cold. I gave the driver the address to my apartment building overlooking the river. I needed to be in a secure location when the financial shockwave hit the shore. The banking algorithms would take approximately 90 minutes to sweep the accounts and trigger the lockouts. By the time the valet brought Richard his car at the end of the night, his credit cards would be useless pieces of plastic. I watched the blurred lights of the Philadelphia skyline slide past the taxi window. The quiet hum of the engine matched the steady rhythm of my pulse. I arrived at my building, rode the elevator to my floor, and unlocked my door. I set my keys on the console table and waited in the silence. The fallout was coming. I walked into my kitchen and turned on the kettle. The scent of dried Earl Grey leaves filled the space, a sharp contrast to the heavy perfume and roasted duck of the Gala. My apartment was a sanctuary of order: hardwood floors, neutral tones, and walls lined with binders of forensic auditing case files. I poured the hot water into a mug and carried it to the living room. I did not turn on the television. I did not play music. I sat on my sofa in the dim light of a single floor lamp, watching the digital clock on my cable box click forward. 11:10, 11:15, 11:20. In the ballroom across town, the final speeches were ending. The waiters were clearing the dessert plates. The event coordinator was likely running the final invoice through the hotel point-of-sale system, expecting the standard corporate auto-approval. 11:30. My phone sat face up on the glass coffee table. The screen was black. I took a slow sip of the tea, letting the bergamot settle my nerves. The silence in my apartment felt profound, weighted with the knowledge of what was happening miles away in a chaotic hotel lobby. Then, the screen glowed white. A text message banner appeared. Julian's name flashed across the top. I did not reach for it immediately. I watched the phone vibrate against the glass, a small, frantic buzz that signaled the end of the illusion and the beginning of the war. The glass surface of my coffee table vibrated, emitting a low, continuous hum against the wood frame. I looked down at the illuminated screen. A text message from Julian sat front and center. "Glad Mom tossed you. This is my house now." I read the words twice, taking a slow sip of my tea. The hot liquid warmed my throat, carrying the sharp, comforting taste of bergamot. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, a sudden autumn storm lashed against the glass, blurring the dark currents of the Schuylkill River below. Inside, my apartment remained a fortress of quiet control. I did not reply to Julian. I let the phone screen dim, plunging the room back into the soft glow of the single floor lamp. Julian possessed the unearned confidence of a man who never had to face a consequence. He spent his 20s burning through Richard's capital on doomed ventures, failing upward, because Sylvia always smoothed the terrain. He truly believed wearing a custom suit and holding a microphone made him a chief executive. 3 minutes later, the screen flared white again. An incoming call from Richard. I did not reach for it. I watched the caller ID pulse until the ring cycle ended and sent him to voicemail. 10 seconds passed. The phone buzzed a second time, then a third, then a fourth. I leaned back into the cushions of the sofa, detached and observant. Over the next 45 minutes, my father called me 50 separate times. The sheer volume of attempts painted a vivid, undeniable picture of the collapse occurring miles away. Richard never called me more than once a month, usually to dictate holiday schedules or demand a signature on minor tax forms. 50 consecutive calls meant the financial architecture of his life was actively tearing apart. I opened my secure laptop and logged into the county clerk database. A green verification banner confirmed the default deed transfer was fully integrated into the public registry. I opened a second tab, accessing the commercial banking portal linked to the trust. The algorithms had performed their duty with ruthless efficiency. I imagined the scene unfolding in the grand ballroom. The speeches were over. The investors were preparing to leave. The event coordinator likely pulled Richard aside, speaking in hushed, apologetic tones regarding a declined corporate card. Richard, irritated but arrogant, probably handed over a secondary platinum account. Another decline. A frantic call to the bank concierge line, standing in the marble hallway, only to be informed by an automated, recorded voice that the collateral underpinning his entire portfolio no longer belonged to his management group. The algorithms do not care about velvet ropes or sequined dresses. They act on hard data. And the data stated Richard owned nothing but the debt. The digital clock on my cable box flipped to 11:42. A heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed through my apartment. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate striking of fists against solid oak. The noise shattered the calm of my living room. Even with years of forensic training, teaching me to detach emotion from conflict. My pulse quickened. I set my mug down, the ceramic clinking softly against the glass table. I did not walk to the door. I picked up my security tablet and accessed the hallway camera feed. The high-definition monitor displayed the corridor outside my unit in stark clarity. Richard and Sylvia stood under the harsh fluorescent light. They looked nothing like the untouchable royalty who had ordered my exile 2 hours prior. The storm outside had caught them during their frantic transit. Sylvia's silver silk dress, the armor she wore to humiliate me, was ruined. Dark, wet patches stained the fabric, clinging awkwardly to her frame. Her perfect hair hung in damp, heavy strands around her face. Richard stood beside her, his tuxedo jacket open, his bow tie hanging loose around his collar. His face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. He struck the door again, leaning his weight against the wood. I pressed the audio button on the tablet interface. My voice filtered through the small speaker mounted above the peephole, calm and level. "You are disturbing my neighbors, Richard." He jumped back, startled by the sudden sound. He glared up at the camera lens, his chest heaving with exertion. "Open this door, Odette." He pointed a trembling finger at the speaker. "You reverse this hack right now. The bank just locked my accounts in front of the entire board. You have no idea the damage you are causing to the company." Sylvia leaned into the frame, her voice shrill, stripped of its usual polished restraint. "I will call the police on you. I will have you arrested for cybercrimes. You cannot just steal a hotel because your feelings are hurt." I watched them on the screen, analyzing their panic through the lens of a federal auditor. They always assumed my quiet nature was a symptom of weakness. They confused my lack of theatrical outbursts with a lack of capability. I pressed the talk button a second time. "There is no hack, Richard. I am simply enforcing the property lines. When Sylvia ordered security to physically remove me from the premises, she triggered the morality clause in the ground lease. The digital registry processed the default an hour ago. You do not own the keystone. You are trespassing on my asset. And Sylvia, if you dial the police, I will gladly ask the officers to escort you out of my residential building for harassment." The silence in the hallway was profound. I watched Richard through the monitor. The bluster drained out of him, replaced by a cold, dawning realization. The math finally clicked together in his mind. He looked at Sylvia. She stared back at him, the threat of calling the authorities dying on her lips. She understood the magnitude of her error. Her simple command to a bouncer had cost her husband his empire. But Richard was not a man who accepted defeat. He built a career out of bending the rules, intimidating rivals, and finding the hidden back door when the front door locked. The shock on his face slowly hardened. His jaw clenched. The panic in his eyes calcified into a dark, focused rage. He stepped closer to the camera lens, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a new, dangerous edge. "You think a piece of paper makes you untouchable, Odette." He wiped the rain from his forehead, smearing the water across his brow. "You think your mother left you a bulletproof vest? You are going to regret this. I will bury you so deep in legal fees, you will beg me to take that property back." He turned on his heel and walked toward the elevator. Sylvia lingered for a fraction of a second, her gaze fixed on the camera, before turning to follow him. The metal doors slid shut, swallowing them both. I turned off the tablet monitor, and the screen went black. The immediate physical threat was gone, but the air in my apartment felt heavier. I walked to the window and looked down at the dark, rushing water of the river. Richard would not surrender the crown jewel of his portfolio. He was retreating to formulate a counterstrike. He would use his wealth, his connections, and his lack of ethics to forge a weapon capable of piercing the blind trust. I closed the blinds, preparing for the morning. The opening skirmish was over, and the real war was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, ordered predictability of the federal government. I walked through the security pavilion of my office building, placing my briefcase on the X-ray conveyor belt. The retired Marine working the scanner gave me his usual brisk nod. I pinned my identification badge to my lapel and rode the elevator to the forensic auditing division. The air up here smelled of institutional floor wax and ozone from the server rooms. It was a sharp departure from the plush velvet and roasted duck of the Keystone Hotel. I preferred the ozone. It smelled like accountability. I sat at my workstation and woke up my dual monitors. The weekend had been quiet after the midnight confrontation at my apartment door. The banking algorithms had executed their duties. I expected Richard to spend Monday scrambling to secure high-interest bridge loans to replace his frozen credit lines. I expected panic. I did not expect the email that chimed in my inbox at 9:14. The sender was Harrison. The subject line contained a single word typed in all caps. Injunction. I clicked the attachment. A pristine, perfectly aligned PDF loaded onto my left monitor. It lacked the slight slant of a document scanned in a rush. It was processed on a high-end corporate machine. At the top of the page sat the official embossed seal of the County Civil Court, signed by Judge Harlan Davis. I recognized the name immediately. Davis was a fixture on the local charity circuit. He frequented the same exclusive country clubs as my father. They drank the same scotch. The document was an emergency temporary restraining order. My desk phone rang. I picked up the receiver. Harrison sounded breathless, the usual polished cadence of his voice replaced by a tight, clipped urgency. "Tell me you are reading it." "I am looking at a stay of execution on the deed transfer," I said, keeping my tone even. "The paperwork cites an addendum." "Richard hired a crisis litigation firm over the weekend," Harrison explained. "They pulled the judge out of bed late Sunday night for an emergency ex parte hearing. You and I were not notified. They presented the court with an amended lease agreement. Richard claims he found it in a neglected safety deposit box early Sunday morning." I scrolled down to the second page of the PDF. The text outlined a direct waiver of the morality clause, specifically neutralizing the forfeiture penalty if the primary heir was ever denied entry. It was a surgical strike aimed directly at the trap I had sprung. I scrolled to the signature line. There, in smooth, flowing blue ink, was my mother's name. "She did not sign this," I told Harrison. Harrison sighed, the sound crackling through the phone line. "It looks identical to her signature on the original trust documents. Odette." The judge accepted it into the preliminary record. The order pauses the property default pending a full civil trial. The deed is frozen in an escrow status. Richard regains operational control of the hotel effective immediately. The banks will unfreeze his credit lines by noon. Furthermore, the injunction grants a proximity stay. You are legally barred from stepping within 500 feet of the Keystone until the trial concludes. I leaned closer to the monitor, scrutinizing the digital ink of the signature. My mother spent her final weeks heavily medicated. Her hands shook. Her genuine signatures from that period carry microscopic tremors, slight hesitations in the loops of her cursive. This signature was flawless. It was the bold, sweeping stroke of a healthy woman. Richard had found someone to forge the document, taking care to backdate it 3 weeks prior to her passing. He bought himself a lifeline, I said. He bought the home field advantage, Harrison corrected. Civil court is his arena. He has unlimited capital to fund a war of attrition. His lawyers will file endless motions, discovery requests, and procedural delays. They will drag this out for years until the legal fees bleed your trust dry. The system is designed to exhaust the party with less money. I will review the filing, I said, and place the receiver back on the cradle. I did not close the PDF. I stared at the seal of Judge Harlan Davis. The illusion of my Friday night victory dissolved, replaced by the cold reality of the battlefield. The trap I set was sound, but I had underestimated my father's willingness to cross the line into outright perjury. He was willing to risk a felony to keep his empire. A sharp buzz on my desk diverted my attention. My cell phone screen lit up, a new text message from Julian. I unlocked the device. The screen populated with a high-resolution photograph. Julian was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk in the CEO suite of the Keystone Hotel. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his Italian leather loafers propped up insolently on the polished wood surface. A lit cigar rested in a crystal ashtray near his elbow. The caption below the image read 2 sentences. "Guess who is back in charge? See you in court, loser." I looked at the image. I studied the details, the expensive shoes, the smug grin, the total lack of fear. Julian viewed this entire conflict as a fraternity prank. He believed his father's wealth was an impenetrable shield. He sent the photograph to inflict emotional pain, hoping I would react with the same helpless frustration I felt when I was a teenager navigating Sylvia's petty cruelties. But I was no longer a teenager. I was a federal auditor. Julian thought he was taunting a defeated rival. He did not realize he was actively sending time-stamped digital evidence of his location and mindset to an investigator. I set the phone face down. Harrison was right about one thing. If I fought Richard in a straightforward civil trial, I would lose. A billionaire on his home turf owns the civil courts. He plays golf with the judges. He attends galas with the arbitrators. He uses his wealth to manipulate the calendar, suffocating his opponents beneath mountains of paperwork. I could not beat him by playing his game. I needed to drag him into an arena where his money meant nothing. I needed to shift the battlefield from the local civil courts to the federal sector. In my world, data does not care about country club memberships. Numbers do not attend charity dinners. To achieve that, I needed to look past the forged lease. The forgery was a desperate shield, but men like Richard only forge documents when they are hiding a much darker secret. The Keystone Hotel was not just a building to him, it was a vault. If he was willing to commit perjury to maintain operational control, it meant the internal ledgers of that hotel contained something he could not afford to let me see. I needed access to those ledgers, but the injunction legally barred me from the property and its internal networks. I could not request the financials through conventional discovery because Richard's lawyers would stonewall the request for years. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The hum of the server room down the hall seemed to sync with my pulse. I needed a distraction. I needed a flare thrown so high into the sky that Richard, Sylvia, and Julian would focus all their attention upward, leaving their back door unguarded. If my father wanted legal theater, I would give him a spectacle. I would file a lawsuit so loud, so embarrassing, and so spectacularly trivial that his fragile ego would force him to crush it publicly. He would pour his elite legal resources into swatting a fly, entirely blind to the fact that I was picking the lock on his vault. I closed the PDF containing the forged injunction. I opened a fresh, encrypted word processor document. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking echoing in the quiet office as I began typing the framework for my counterattack. I titled the draft document, Notice of Civil Claim. I was about to sue my family for emotional distress. It was the weakest, most pathetic legal maneuver imaginable, and they were going to fall for it. I called Harrison back before noon. I instructed him to draft a new complaint. He assumed I wanted to appeal the forged injunction. When I told him to file a civil suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress and public defamation, the silence on the line stretched for several seconds. Harrison was a shark in estate law. He did not traffic in hurt feelings. He argued contracts. "You want to sue them for making you sad?" Harrison asked. His tone carried a rare note of disbelief. "Odette?" "Richard has a $500 million war chest. He retains Sterling and Croft, the most cutthroat corporate litigators in Pennsylvania. If we file a tort claim over a ballroom snub, they will laugh us out of the courtroom. They will request sanctions for frivolous litigation. I want them to laugh," I replied. "I want them to point their entire artillery battery at a paper target." I explained the architecture of the distraction. Richard built his identity on the perception of invulnerability. His fragile ego dictated his strategy. A quiet procedural property dispute in a judge's chambers bored him. A loud public lawsuit accusing him and his new wife of bullying his own blood relative would enrage him. He would view it as a direct assault on his social standing. He would order his elite attorneys to crush the lawsuit with overwhelming force, to make an example out of me. "File it," I said. "Ask for $10 million in punitive damages. Leak the filing to the Philadelphia business journals. Make it loud." By Tuesday morning, the process server delivered the thick stack of civil subpoenas to the executive suite of the Keystone Hotel. I knew the exact moment the papers arrived. My cell phone buzzed on my desk. Another text from Julian. He did not use words this time. He sent a short video clip. I pressed play. The footage showed his new mahogany desk. The pristine, court-stamped subpoena sat flat on the wood. Julian reached into the frame and placed a plastic cup of iced coffee directly onto the county seal. Condensation dripped down the side of the cup, pooling over my name, soaking into the heavy parchment. He lifted the beverage, leaving a wet, mocking ring on the legal document, and offered a thumbs up to the camera. He used my threat as a coaster. He felt untouchable. I watched the video twice. I did not feel a spike of anger. I felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of a hunter watching a target step onto a snare. Julian was blind to the mechanics of the trap. Richard reacted exactly as predicted. Within 48 hours, the senior partners at Sterling and Croft filed a 70-page motion to dismiss. They did not just defend their client. They went on the offensive. They issued press releases. They scheduled television interviews on local financial networks. Sylvia hired a crisis public relations consultant to spin the narrative, painting me as a hysterical, estranged daughter attempting to extort her loving family. They spent hundreds of billable hours formulating character assassinations. They focused every ounce of their energy on a lawsuit designed to fail. While they looked right, I moved left. Civil discovery requires permission. If I asked Richard for the hotel ledgers through Harrison, his lawyers would file endless objections. They would claim trade secrets. They would redact every line. Federal auditing does not ask for permission. It demands compliance. Because the original deed transfer triggered a brief freeze on interstate commercial accounts during the Gala, the sudden volatility flagged a routine compliance review in my division. I leveraged that flag. I walked down the hall to the secure terminal room. I bypassed Richard, Julian, and Sylvia entirely. I aimed my inquiry directly at the central banking clearinghouses that processed the Keystone Hotel transactions. I drafted a federal subpoena for 5 years of continuous, unredacted, internal banking ledgers for the management group. I did not need a local judge to sign it. I needed a federal magistrate. Federal magistrates do not play golf with my father. They grant warrants based on probable cause of financial irregularities. The forged signature on the amended lease provided the perfect shadow of a doubt. I transmitted the secure request at 4 in the afternoon. The clearinghouses are legally obligated to comply with federal subpoenas within 3 business days. They do not notify the account holder. Richard's bankers would compile the raw data and transmit it directly to my encrypted server without ever placing a phone call to the Keystone. The decoy was holding strong. I tracked the news alerts on my secondary monitor. Richard was currently hosting a charity luncheon, telling reporters about the painful burden of dealing with an unstable child. He wore his victimhood like a tailored suit. He thought he was controlling the narrative. He thought he had trapped me in a legal corner where his wealth gave him the ultimate advantage. He forgot that wealth leaves a paper trail. On Thursday, the first data packets began arriving on my secure terminal. Zip files containing thousands of raw transaction codes, wire transfers, and payroll disbursements flowed into my database. It was the unfiltered, unedited truth of the Flores real estate empire. I spent the afternoon running preliminary algorithmic sweeps over the data. I instructed the software to look for anomalies, ghost accounts, and irregular offshore transfers. I watched the progress bar on my screen. The trap was closing. I had bypassed the forged injunction, slipped past his elite legal team, and breached the vault. But arrogance is a volatile element. Julian could not simply sit back and let his lawyers handle the decoy lawsuit. His ego required a personal victory. He needed to see me surrender. The iced coffee coaster was not enough. He craved physical dominance. My desk phone rang. It was not Harrison. It was the security pavilion in the main lobby of my federal building. The retired Marine guard spoke in a low, measured tone. "Ms. Flores, you have a visitor at the primary checkpoint. He lacks an appointment. He refuses to leave the screening area. He claims he is the CEO of the Keystone Group and demands you come down to receive legal correspondence." I looked at the security camera feed available on the internal network. Julian stood in the federal lobby. He wore a sharp gray suit, holding a manila folder, pacing back and forth across the granite tiles. He was yelling at a receptionist. He brought the conflict to my doorstep. He thought he was arriving as an executioner, delivering the final blow to my trivial lawsuit. He did not know he was walking into a federal facility while carrying the very evidence that would orchestrate his own ruin. I locked my workstation, stood up from my desk, and walked toward the elevators. The next phase of the audit required a face-to-face encounter. The elevator doors parted with a quiet hum, revealing the expansive, echoing expanse of the federal lobby. The walls were clad in cold gray granite, a stark contrast to the warm mahogany and brass of Julian's accustomed environment. It was a space designed for serious consequence, void of plush seating or deferential staff. Julian stood near the primary screening checkpoint. He was flanked by a row of metal detectors and a team of uniformed officers. His charcoal suit hung perfectly on his frame, the fabric a testament to expensive tailoring. He held a thick manila folder in his left hand, tapping it impatiently against his thigh. He looked entirely out of place, a peacock stranded in an armory. I watched him berate the receptionist behind the reinforced glass partition. His voice bounced off the stone walls, carrying the shrill edge of inherited entitlement. He demanded immediate access to my floor. He cited his father's name. He referenced his position at the Keystone Group. He threw titles at a wall that did not care about private wealth. I walked toward the security desk. Julian caught sight of me. His posture shifted instantly, inflating with aggressive confidence. He stepped away from the glass partition, moving to intercept my path. He did not make it far. The retired Marine guard intercepted him with the fluid, effortless motion of a man accustomed to redirecting hostility. The guard did not yell. He simply planted his boots, shifting his broad shoulders to create an impassable human barrier. The polished leather of Julian's $2,000 loafers skidded to an awkward halt on the polished floor. "Sir," the guard said, his tone devoid of any customer service warmth, "you will remain behind the yellow demarcation line until the federal employee authorizes your proximity." Julian bristled, his face flushing. He glared at the guard, then looked at me, a sneer curling his lip. You hide behind rent-a-cops, Odette. How pathetic. I stopped 3 feet from the demarcation line. I kept my hands at my sides. I did not match his volume or his energy. State your business. Julian, this is a secure facility. He ripped the manila folder open. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. It was the forged, amended lease, the exact paperwork Richard's lawyers had filed with Judge Davis to secure the emergency injunction. The pages were pristine, printed on heavy legal stock. Julian held the document out, waving it in the space between us like a conquering flag. Sterling and Croft are filing a motion for sanctions against you tomorrow morning, he announced, his voice echoing across the lobby. We are going to countersue you for legal fees and public defamation. Your little emotional distress lawsuit is dead on arrival. Dad wants you to know that by the time we finish the discovery process, your blind trust will be bankrupt. He took a step closer, testing the perimeter. The Marine Guard shifted his weight, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. Julian stopped. You lost, Odette, he continued, his tone turning vicious. Mom threw you out. The judge threw your claim out. You do not own the hotel. You own nothing. You are a bitter, isolated bureaucrat sitting in a gray cubicle. Sign the withdrawal forms, drop the civil suit, and maybe Dad will let you keep your cheap apartment. Julian expected a reaction. He wanted me to flush with anger. He wanted tears, or screaming, or a desperate defense of my mother's legacy. He wanted to witness the emotional distress I had formally claimed in my decoy lawsuit. I did not give him the satisfaction. I remained perfectly still. My eyes tracked the motion of the document in his hand. As he waved the heavy parchment, the overhead fluorescent lights caught the embossed seal on the final page. It was the notary stamp, the official state insignia validating the forged signature of my late mother. My forensic training kicked in, a reflex built from years of dissecting thousands of fraudulent financial records. I focused on the circular impression. The ink was a crisp, dark blue. The notary's name curved around the top arc. The commission expiration date curved along the bottom. And right in the center, beneath the Commonwealth seal, sat the 7-digit notary identification number. Julian held the paper steady for a fraction of a second, aiming it at my face like a weapon. In that brief window, I memorized the 7 digits. The numbers aligned in my mind, locking into place. In Pennsylvania, notary identification numbers are issued sequentially by the Department of State. I knew the numeric sequence blocks for the year my mother passed away. I knew them because I audited municipal bond fraud for 3 consecutive years, cross-referencing thousands of local deeds. The ID number on the stamp Julian held started with a sequence block that did not exist during my mother's lifetime. The man who stamped that document received his commission at least 24 months after the date written on the paper. The signature was a forgery. But the notary stamp was a verifiable, chronological impossibility. It was a fatal structural flaw in Richard's impenetrable defense. The document in Julian's hand was not a shield. It was a confession to a felony. I looked up from the paper, meeting Julian's gaze. His smirk remained fixed, oblivious to the catastrophic error he had just committed. He thought he was delivering a death blow to my legal strategy. He had no idea he just handed me the exact key required to unlock a federal indictment. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Julian scoffed, shoving the documents back into the folder. He threw the folder onto the visitor registration desk. Keep a copy. Frame it. Put it next to your Government Employee of the Month award. We own the ground, Odette. Remember that. He turned on his heel, his expensive loafers clicking sharply against the granite as he marched toward the revolving doors. He pushed through the glass, stepping out into the busy Philadelphia street, radiating the triumphant energy of a man who believed he had won the war. I watched him disappear into the crowd. The Marine Guard stepped back to his post, adjusting his duty belt. Problem resolved. Miss Flores? I picked up the manila folder from the desk. The heavy parchment felt coarse against my fingertips. I did not feel the sting of Julian's insults. I felt the cold, electric surge of absolute clarity. Julian's ambush provided the missing link. I rode the elevator back to my floor, my mind racing through the procedural steps required to weaponize the anomaly. A forged signature in a civil dispute often results in endless handwriting analysis, dueling experts, and muddy conclusions. A judge like Harlan Davis could easily dismiss a signature discrepancy as a simple clerical variation. But a chronological impossibility is a hard, unyielding fact. You cannot backdate a government-issued identification number. The state registry holds the absolute truth. The notary stamp transformed Richard's desperate maneuver from a civil contract dispute into provable criminal perjury and wire fraud. I sat at my workstation and accessed the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Department of State database. I ran the 7-digit notary identification number through the secure portal. The search took 3 seconds. The result populated on my right monitor. The notary commission was issued to a man named Arthur Vance. The issue date was 26 months after the date my mother supposedly signed the amended lease. The expiration date matched the stamp. I leaned back in my chair. Richard paid a man who was not a notary at the time to stamp a backdated, forged document, and then submitted that document across state lines via digital servers to secure a federal injunction. He crossed the line from a sleazy businessman to a federal criminal. But I could not trigger the arrest yet. If I exposed the forgery right now, Richard would sacrifice the notary, claim ignorance, and retreat. The Keystone Hotel would remain frozen in civil litigation limbo. I needed to know why Richard was willing to risk a felony to maintain control of the property. I needed to see what the forged lease was protecting. I turned my attention to the left monitor. The central banking clearinghouses had finished transmitting the 5 years of internal management ledgers. The raw data sat on my encrypted server, waiting to be processed. Julian's ambush proved they were desperate. Arrogance masks fear. The more aggressively they attacked my decoy lawsuit, the more terrified they were of losing the building. The truth was buried in the numbers. It was time to dig. I engaged the forensic auditing software, selected the raw data files, and hit execute. The real investigation began. The federal building emptied around me as the sun dipped below the Philadelphia skyline. The fluorescent lights overhead shifted into their low-power night mode, casting long, sharp shadows across the banks of silent cubicles. I did not leave. I locked the heavy glass door to my suite, pulled the blinds shut, and isolated myself in the glow of my dual monitors. The raw data provided by the clearinghouses sat on my secure server, a sprawling, chaotic digital wilderness of transaction codes, routing numbers, and automated clearinghouse transfers. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical click-clack of my keyboard. It was a sound I found deeply comforting. It was the rhythm of accountability. While Richard and Sylvia slept in their sprawling suburban estate, insulated by forged documents and high-priced lawyers, I was mapping the fault lines of their empire. Forensic auditing requires a specific type of endurance. You do not find fraud by looking at the headline numbers. You find it by tracking the mundane, repetitive operational expenses that hide in plain sight. I spent the first night stripping away the legitimate expenditures. I isolated the hotel payroll, the vendor contracts, the municipal utility payments, and the standardized debt servicing. By 3 a.m, my eyes burned, and my coffee had gone cold. But the digital noise began to fall away, revealing the underlying structure of the Keystone Group's cash flow. I noticed the first anomaly during the second night. It started as a small recurring discrepancy in the hotel's capital improvement budget. According to the internal ledgers, the Keystone Group initiated a comprehensive multi-million-dollar HVAC upgrade 3 years ago. The line item showed consistent, heavy monthly disbursements to a vendor listed as Apex Climate Solutions. The payments were large enough to avoid triggering daily limits, but small enough to bypass executive board oversight. I ran the vendor identification number through the Federal Commercial Registry. Apex Climate Solutions was a limited liability corporation registered in Delaware. That in itself was not unusual. Many legitimate companies incorporate in Delaware for tax advantages. But the company possessed no physical address, no registered phone number, and 0 employee tax identification filings. The listed registered agent was a post office box in Wilmington. Apex Climate Solutions was a ghost entity. I dug deeper, cross-referencing the outgoing transfers. Over the course of 36 months, the Keystone Management Group wired exactly $2.4 million into the Apex accounts. The money vanished into the ether, categorized as routine maintenance. But the physical reality of the hotel told a different story. I remembered the Gala. I remembered the subtle, persistent hum of the aging air conditioning units in the ballroom. No one spends $2 million on climate control and retains 30-year-old vents. The money was gone. I shifted my focus to the hotel's marketing and procurement budgets. I found a second phantom vendor, a public relations consultancy firm charging a staggering $50,000 a month on retainer. The payments flowed into a Cayman Islands routing number. Another empty shell, another missing million. By the third night, the mechanical rhythm of my keyboard accelerated. The isolated anomalies coalesced into a clear, undeniable pattern. Richard was not just mismanaging the property. He was systematically bleeding the operational reserves dry. The total missing capital reached $5 million. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing the tension from my temples. The sheer scale of the theft forced me to recalibrate my understanding of the conflict. I originally believed Richard forged the lease amendment simply out of territorial greed. I thought he wanted to protect his status as a local real estate mogul. I was wrong. He forged the document out of sheer, unadulterated terror. If I successfully seized control of the Keystone Hotel through the morality clause, my first action as the new owner would be a comprehensive audit of the property's operational health. The moment I took possession of the physical ledgers, the missing $5 million would immediately trigger a mandatory report to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The investors would pull their funding. The creditors would demand immediate repayment. The entire house of cards would collapse in a matter of days. Richard did not fight me to save his pride. He fought me to stay out of federal prison. But a seasoned corporate criminal like my father rarely steals from his primary asset, unless he is cornered. Richard was ruthless, but he was not stupid. He knew bleeding the Keystone would eventually cause the physical property to deteriorate. He needed the cash for something urgent, something that threatened his immediate survival. I traced the outbound flow of the missing funds from the dummy corporations. The money did not sit in the Cayman accounts. It bounced through 3 different digital wallets before landing in a corporate account belonging to a company called Zenith Horizon Technologies. I pulled up the corporate filing for Zenith Horizon. The CEO and primary shareholder listed on the founding charter was Julian Flores. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a harsh, unforgiving finality. Julian spent the last 4 years attempting to launch a tech startup. He touted Zenith Horizon as a revolutionary logistics software platform. He gave interviews to local business blogs, posing in expensive suits, pitching himself as a Silicon Valley visionary operating on the East Coast. He burned through his initial seed capital in 6 months, spending the money on lavish office spaces and corporate retreats rather than software development. When the legitimate funding dried up, the startup began to fail. Julian faced the very public, humiliating collapse of his visionary persona. Sylvia would not allow her son to fail. She viewed his success as her own validation. She must have pressured Richard to save the company. But Richard's legitimate capital was tied up in strict real estate covenants. He could not simply write Julian a $5 million check without triggering investor audits. So, he created the dummy corporations. He siphoned the money out of the Keystone Hotel maintenance budgets, laundered it through the shell companies, and fed it directly into Julian's failing startup to keep the illusion alive. The revelation fundamentally altered the dynamics of the war. Richard did not announce Julian as the new CEO of the Keystone Group out of nepotism or legacy building. The promotion was a calculated, desperate defensive maneuver. By making Julian the official chief executive of the hotel, Richard placed the legal and fiduciary responsibility for the property squarely on Julian's shoulders. If the missing money was ever discovered, the paper trail would point to the CEO. Richard was setting his own stepson up as the primary fall guy. Julian was not inheriting an empire. He was inheriting a crime scene. Julian's arrogant, mocking texts took on a pathetic, tragic quality. He paraded through my federal lobby, waving a forged document, boasting about his new mahogany desk, completely blind to the fact that his father handed him that desk to serve as a human shield. The $5 million was gone. Julian's startup failed anyway, quietly dissolving its physical offices a month prior to the gala. The money evaporated. The hotel was broke. I stared at the dual monitors, the raw data illuminating the depth of the rot. The stakes were no longer confined to a civil property dispute over a ground lease. I held the irrefutable evidence of a massive, coordinated corporate embezzlement scheme spanning multiple state lines and international borders. But identifying the crime was only the first step. Proving it required connecting the digital trail to physical consequences. I needed to know how bad the financial damage truly was. A $5 million hole in the operating budget meant the hotel was likely failing its municipal safety inspections, skipping vendor payments, and defaulting on basic service contracts. The Keystone was a sinking ship. If I took ownership now, I would inherit a toxic asset, carrying millions in hidden liabilities. Richard's forged injunction was ironically acting as a temporary buffer, shielding my blind trust from the immediate fallout of the embezzlement. I could not simply strike back with the audit data yet. I needed to understand the true pressure Richard was under. If the hotel was broke, he needed fresh capital immediately just to keep the lights on and prevent the employees from walking out. He needed a cash injection large enough to cover the stolen $5 million before the fiscal quarter ended. I closed the audit files and opened the local financial news feeds. The answer stared back at me in a minor headline buried in the business section. Richard Flores was scheduled to host an emergency, closed-door meeting with a syndicate of private equity investors at a rival hotel across town in exactly 3 days. The objective of the meeting was to secure a massive high-interest bridge loan to stabilize the Keystone Group. The narrative shifted abruptly. The conflict escalated from a quiet forensic investigation into a race against the clock. If Richard secured that bridge loan, he would plug the $5 million hole. He would pay off the desperate vendors, stabilize the property, and effectively erase the evidence of the embezzlement. The audit data on my screen would become useless, outdated history. I could not let him reach that boardroom. The shadow debt looming over the hotel required a different kind of weapon. I needed to understand exactly who Julian owed money to before I detonated the explosive. The harsh glow of the monitors cast my reflection in the dark glass of the office window. It was 4 a.m. The initial shock of the embezzlement settled into a cold, focused urgency. $5 million missing from the operational budget explained Richard's terror and the forged lease. But something about the sequence of transfers to Julian's failed startup still gnawed at the edges of my logic. As a forensic auditor, I tracked the psychology of fraud just as closely as the numbers. Richard was a calculated risk taker. He would siphon funds to save his wife's son from public humiliation, but he would do it slowly, bleeding the accounts over years to avoid triggering internal alarms. The data on my screen showed a different pattern entirely. The final $2.5 million did not trickle out of the Keystone accounts. It vanished in a single, massive wire transfer executed 3 weeks before the gala. That was an act of raw panic. A sudden hemorrhage of capital implies an immediate, catastrophic threat. I leaned forward, pulling the detailed routing information for that specific transaction. The money did not go to Julian's defunct tech company. It bypassed the startup entirely. The funds traveled through a series of untraceable digital wallets before terminating in a holding account registered to a holding company called Blackwood Capital. I ran the name through the federal database. Blackwood Capital was not a traditional private equity firm. It did not appear on any regulated exchange. It possessed no public website, no corporate board, and no filing history with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Blackwood Capital was a shadow lender. The realization hit me with physical force, tightening my chest and accelerating my pulse. The narrative fractured, plunging the conflict into an entirely new, dangerous dimension. Shadow lenders do not operate within the bounds of civil law. They do not care about forged ground leases or municipal court injunctions. They cater to desperate individuals who have exhausted all legitimate avenues of credit. They provide massive, unsecured capital injections at predatory, illegal interest rates. When a borrower defaults, they do not file a lawsuit. They strip assets. They seize collateral by force. They dismantle lives. My mind flashed back to the night of the gala. I remembered the exact moment Sylvia ordered security to remove me. Julian was standing near the VIP tables, watching the exchange. The ballroom was heavily air-conditioned, maintaining a crisp 68 degrees to accommodate the heavy formal wear. Yet, Julian was sweating. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead. He kept checking his phone, his eyes darting toward the exits. I initially attributed his behavior to the nerves of assuming the CEO position. It was not nerves. It was terror. The puzzle assembled itself with ruthless clarity. Julian's startup failed over a year ago. To hide the collapse from Richard and Sylvia, he sought outside capital to keep the illusion alive. He approached Blackwood Capital. But shadow lenders do not hand over millions of dollars to a failed tech bro without leverage. They demanded collateral. Julian, lacking any tangible assets of his own, used his upcoming status as the future CEO of the Keystone Group to pledge the hotel's operational revenue as collateral for the illicit loan. He borrowed millions in the shadows, gambling that his new startup pivot would generate enough cash to pay them back before Richard ever noticed the debt. He lost the gamble. The startup imploded entirely. The shadow loan matured. The predators came to collect. When the Blackwood Syndicate demanded repayment, Julian finally confessed the debt to his mother. Sylvia, desperate to protect her son from violent retaliation, forced Richard to fix the problem. That single, massive $2.5 million transfer 3 weeks before the gala was Richard's desperate attempt to pay off the Shadow Syndicate and save Julian's life. But dealing with unregulated predators is never a clean transaction. The $2.5 million likely only covered the predatory interest and penalties. The principal balance remained active. The hotel was not just broke, it was actively mortgaged to an underground criminal enterprise. This plot twist obliterated my previous strategy. I was no longer fighting a slow, methodical civil war against my father. I was racing against a ticking financial time bomb. If I allowed Richard to maintain control of the property under the protection of the forged injunction, the shadow lenders would eventually grow tired of his delayed payments. They would execute their illegal claim on the hotel. They would strip the accounts, seize the physical assets, and drive the Keystone into a violent, irrecoverable bankruptcy. By the time I successfully proved the forgery and legally reclaimed the property, my mother's legacy would be a smoldering pile of toxic debt. I could not wait for the federal wheels of justice to turn slowly. I needed to shatter the illusion of Richard's control immediately, before the Shadow Syndicate realized the hotel was insolvent. The pressure in the quiet office felt suffocating. I needed to freeze the assets completely, rendering the hotel financially untouchable to both Richard and the underground lenders. The only way to achieve that level of absolute lockdown was to force a federal receiver to take emergency custody of the property. To trigger a federal receivership, I needed undeniable proof that the current management was actively engaged in ongoing, catastrophic fraud that threatened interstate commerce. The forged notary stamp and the dummy shell corporations provided a solid foundation, but the involvement of the Blackwood Syndicate elevated the threat to a national security level. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct line to the regional director of the Federal White-Collar Crime Division. The digital clock on my monitor read 4:45 in the morning. Agents who hunt financial predators do not sleep. The line connected. The director answered with a sharp, alert greeting. "I have a situation escalating beyond civil jurisdiction," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I need an emergency audience with the Asset Forfeiture Task Force." The director paused. "State the nature of the escalation." "Odette. The Keystone Group is currently servicing an illicit, multi-million-dollar debt to an unregistered shadow syndicate operating under the moniker Blackwood Capital. The current CEO pledged a commercial property valued at $20 million as collateral without legal authority. The management is actively embezzling operational funds across state lines to service the debt." I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. The director was already running the Blackwood name through the federal database. "Bring me the raw ledgers by 8 o'clock this morning," the director commanded. "If you can verify the outbound transfers to an unregistered syndicate, I will authorize a preliminary review for asset seizure." I hung up the phone. The physical exhaustion of the long night vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of an impending strike. I spent the next 3 hours compiling the transaction logs, highlighting the dummy corporations, and tracing the final massive wire transfer to the Blackwood holding account. I built a bulletproof, mathematically undeniable narrative of corporate desperation and illegal finance. By 7:30, I printed the comprehensive dossier. The thick stack of paper felt heavy in my hands. It was the culmination of thousands of line items, representing the absolute ruin of Richard's empire. I placed the dossier into a secure federal transport folder and prepared to leave my suite. My strategy was locked. I would present the evidence to the federal director, secure the authorization for an emergency asset freeze, and legally paralyze the hotel before the shadow lenders could strip it bare. But as I reached for the door handle, my cell phone vibrated violently against my desk. I paused, looking back at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown, encrypted number. In my line of work, encrypted calls at 7:30 in the morning rarely deliver good news. I walked back to the desk and picked up the device. I accepted the call, pressing the phone to my ear. I did not speak. I waited for the caller to establish contact. The line hissed with faint static. A voice spoke, sharp, cultured, and entirely stripped of the arrogant bluster I associated with my family. "We need to meet, Odette. Today." It was Sylvia. Her tone was unrecognizable. The polished, high society sneer she wielded in the ballroom was gone. The shrill panic she displayed in my apartment hallway was absent. Her voice carried the cold, brittle resonance of a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down at the jagged rocks below. The conflict abruptly shifted gears. The rats were beginning to sense the water rising in the lower decks. Richard's desperate maneuvers were failing to hold the alliance together. Sylvia was reaching out. She was preparing to break rank. I gripped the phone, assessing the sudden tactical advantage of a defector. The war was moving out of the digital ledgers and back into the physical world. I did not answer her immediately. I let the silence hang over the encrypted cellular connection. Sylvia breathed heavily into the receiver. The sound lacked her usual rhythmic control. She named a boutique coffee shop in the Rittenhouse Square district. It was a location situated far away from the financial center, far from the prying eyes of Richard's corporate allies and country club informants. I agreed to the location and ended the call. I placed my printed federal dossier into the secure steel vault beneath my desk and locked the mechanism. The asset seizure request could wait 2 hours. A high-level defector always carries actionable intelligence. I needed to see exactly how deep the fractures in Richard's alliance ran before I detonated the final charge. The morning air carried the sharp chill of late autumn. The coffee shop smelled of roasted espresso beans and wet leaves tracked in by the morning commuters. I arrived 15 minutes early, securing a small circular table in the back corner of the room. The ambient noise of grinding machines and casual conversations provided a perfect acoustic shield against unwanted listeners. I ordered a plain black tea and waited. Sylvia walked through the glass entrance at precisely 8 o'clock. She wore a tailored beige trench coat with the collar pulled high to obscure her profile. Oversized dark sunglasses covered the upper half of her face. She looked like a woman fleeing a crime scene. She lacked the predatory grace she exhibited in the Keystone Ballroom. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders drawn tight against an invisible weight. She scanned the room, spotted me in the corner, and navigated through the crowded tables. She did not take off her coat. She slid into the wooden chair across from me and removed her sunglasses. The skin around her eyes was drawn and pale. The meticulous cosmetic veneer she spent hours perfecting every morning was absent. Sylvia built her entire life on the calculus of proximity and appearance. She identified men with capital, embedded herself in their inner circle, and systematically eliminated any perceived threats to her position. I was her primary target when she married my father. I was the relic of a previous marriage, an uncontrollable variable she needed to erase. She spent 15 years curating a reality where I did not exist. She dictated holiday schedules, manipulated trust fund distributions, and ensured my name never appeared on the corporate letterhead. Now, that social currency was worthless. The reality she curated was collapsing, and she brought the ruins to my table. A barista arrived and set an $8 matcha latte in front of her. Sylvia wrapped both of her hands around the ceramic mug. Her fingers trembled. The bright green liquid rippled inside the cup, transferring the kinetic energy of her panic into a visible metric. The ceramic clattered softly against the porcelain saucer. "You look tired, Sylvia," I said. My voice remained flat, an observational tone devoid of sympathy. She ignored the remark. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a rapid, breathless whisper. "Richard is losing his mind, Odette. The banks locked the secondary credit accounts yesterday afternoon. The vendors are calling his personal cell phone. He spent the entire night screaming at his attorneys, demanding they find a way to bankrupt you through this emotional distress lawsuit." I took a slow sip of my tea. The decoy was performing flawlessly. And what does Julian think of the situation? Sylvia flinched at the mention of her son. Julian is terrified. The hotel operational accounts are empty. You know this. I know you know this. You are an auditor. You filed that ridiculous civil suit to keep Richard distracted while you pull the strings behind the curtain. Richard thinks you are just throwing a tantrum. He thinks he can crush you in court. He does not understand the danger. She reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed it flat on the wooden table, keeping her hand resting on the paper. "I understand the danger," Sylvia continued. "I know about the missing funds. I know Julian made a terrible mistake. But Richard forced him into the CEO position to take the fall. Richard is planning to let my son go to prison to protect his own legacy. I will not allow that to happen." The transaction was unfolding exactly as I anticipated. Loyalty among thieves is a fragile construct, easily shattered by the threat of incarceration. "I have a proposition," she said. She slid the envelope across the table until the edge touched my tea saucer. Inside this folder are the routing numbers, digital keys, and login credentials for 3 offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man. Richard set them up a decade ago. He hid millions in untaxed real estate dividends from the federal government. He hid them from the divorce settlement with your mother. He hid them from everyone. I looked at the envelope, then back to her face. "If you hand this folder to your federal superiors," Sylvia whispered, "the resulting tax evasion and fraud charges will guarantee Richard spends the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. The Keystone Group will be liquidated. You will win. You can avenge your mother and take the entire empire." She paused, taking a ragged breath. Her eyes searched my face for a spark of greed or vindication. "But I need 3 things in return," she stipulated. "First, you drop the civil lawsuit naming me as a defendant. Second, when the federal authorities seize the hotel, you guarantee a $2 million severance payout is routed to a clean account for Julian and me. Third, you sign a binding non-disclosure agreement stating I provided this intelligence under full federal immunity." Sylvia leaned back, her trembling hands retreating to her lap. She served her husband on a silver platter, fully prepared to facilitate his destruction to preserve a fraction of her stolen lifestyle. I looked at the manila envelope. It represented years of calculated deceit. It represented the hidden wealth my father valued over his own family. A younger version of me, the teenager who cried when her father missed her college graduation to attend a golf tournament with Sylvia, might have taken the folder. I did not touch the paper. I do not negotiate with accomplices, I told her. The color drained from Sylvia's face. The fragile hope holding her posture together snapped. "Odette, you need this. This is the silver bullet. You cannot beat his lawyers without it." I leaned forward, mirroring her proximity, and dismantled her illusion with forensic precision. "I do not need your envelope, Sylvia. You are attempting to sell me a weapon for a war I have already won. I do not care about his offshore tax havens. I care about the shadow debt." Sylvia gasped, a sharp intake of air that drew the attention of a patron at the next table. She recoiled as if I had struck her. "I know about Blackwood Capital," I continued, keeping my volume low and lethal. "I know Julian leveraged my mother's hotel to a criminal syndicate to cover his failed startup. I know Richard wired $2.5 million to the syndicate 3 weeks ago to keep them from breaking your son's legs. The entire family is drowning in illicit debt. And you think you can buy a lifeboat with outdated tax records?" Sylvia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Her breathing turned shallow and erratic. She realized the depth of her exposure. She brought a knife to a missile strike. "Your son committed federal wire fraud," I said. "Your husband committed perjury and forgery. You facilitated the environment that allowed it to happen. I am not granting you immunity. I am not giving you a severance package. When the federal raid occurs, you will stand in the wreckage with the rest of them." I stood up, adjusting the strap of my leather briefcase over my shoulder. I left a $10 bill on the table to cover the drinks. Sylvia reached out, her trembling fingers grabbing the cuff of my blazer. Her grip was weak, lacking the bruising force of the security guard she commanded days ago. "Odette, wait," she pleaded, her voice cracked, stripping away the last remnant of her dignity. "You do not understand what Richard is capable of doing when he is trapped. He knows the decoy lawsuit is failing to drain your resources. He suspects you are digging into the hotel archives. He told Julian last night he is preparing a final contingency plan." I looked down at her hand until she released my sleeve. "What contingency plan?" Sylvia swallowed hard. "It is about your mother. He kept files, medical evaluations from the final weeks of her hospice care, doctors who were willing to sign specialized affidavits for the right price. He is going to claim she was clinically insane when she drafted the blind trust. He is going to leak the fabrications to the media and file them in open court. He will drag her memory through the dirt until you surrender the deed." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a warning born of pure desperation. "He is going to meet you in person. He is going to break you." I turned away from the table, leaving the manila envelope sitting next to her cooling matcha latte. The revelation settled into my chest, a cold, heavy stone of realization. Richard was bypassing the financial battlefield entirely. He was preparing to wage psychological warfare using the only vulnerability I possessed. The conflict was hurtling toward its darkest chapter. and the federal ledgers in my vault could not protect me from the impending emotional extortion. I left the coffee shop and walked back to the Federal Plaza. Sylvia's desperate warning echoed in my mind, a persistent rhythm beneath my thoughts. Richard was preparing a final contingency plan. He intended to break me before the civil courts could rule on the decoy lawsuit. I spent the remainder of my shift securing the Blackwood Capital transaction logs inside my steel vault, unable to shake the impending dread. The financial audit was solid, but financial crimes take days to process through the bureaucratic channels of the justice system. A desperate man does not wait for the bureaucracy. By 7 o'clock that evening, the autumn sky turned pitch black. I drove back to my residential building, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The tires of my sedan squeaked against the painted concrete ramp as I descended into the subterranean parking facility beneath my apartment complex. The underground garage was a cavernous, isolated space. Thick concrete pillars held up the structure, creating blind spots and echoing corridors. The air smelled of cold exhaust fumes and damp dust. As I approached my assigned spot, a single fluorescent tube light flickered overhead. It buzzed with an erratic, insect-like hum, struggling to maintain a steady current. The failing fixture cast long, harsh, skeletal shadows across the gray floor. Underneath that erratic light stood my father. Richard leaned against the concrete pillar adjacent to my parking space. He wore a dark overcoat over a tailored suit, but the garments seemed to hang loosely on his frame. The ambient shadows accentuated the deep lines etched into his face. He looked gaunt, stripped of the vibrant, booming charisma he projected at the gala just days prior. The suffocating pressure of his frozen accounts and the looming shadow debt was eroding his physical health. Yet his eyes retained a cold, predatory focus. He was a cornered animal preparing to strike. I parked my car, turned off the ignition, and unbuckled my seatbelt. I did not want to step out into the isolated garage, but remaining inside the vehicle would signal weakness. I opened the door and stepped onto the cold concrete. Richard pushed himself off the pillar. He did not offer a greeting. He moved to block my path to the elevator vestibule. "You are a stubborn woman, Odette," he said. His voice echoed faintly off the low ceiling. "You spent the entire week running a public smear campaign against me and your stepmother. Your attorneys are filing endless motions for emotional distress. You think you are winning this war of attrition." He still believed the decoy lawsuit was my primary objective. He remained blissfully unaware of the federal audit, the Blackwood discovery, and Sylvia's morning defection. I kept my expression neutral, hiding the immense tactical advantage I held. "Move out of my way, Richard." He reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat. He did not pull out a weapon. He withdrew a thin, cream-colored folder. He held it up under the flickering fluorescent light. "You force me to make difficult decisions," he said, his tone dripping with mock sorrow. "I tried to handle this dispute quietly through the civil courts. You refused to accept the amended lease. You chose to make this a public spectacle. Now, I must protect my company by addressing the root cause of this entire mess." He opened the folder. Inside sat a stack of medical records bearing the letterhead of a prominent local psychiatric clinic. I recognized the clinic name immediately. It was an expensive, elite facility Richard donated money to annually. "These are finalized, newly uncovered affidavits regarding your mother's cognitive decline during her final months," he explained. I stared at the papers. My mother never visited a psychiatric clinic. Her oncology team managed her palliative care. Richard tapped the top page with his index finger. I retained a specialist willing to review her hospice logs. The doctor concluded Elena suffered from severe, untreated dementia, characterized by paranoid delusions and a total break from reality. The breath caught in my throat. The sheer cruelty of the fabrication paralyzed my forensic detachment. Richard stepped closer, invading my personal space. "The court will see that Elena was legally incompetent when she drafted that blind trust in the ground lease. She lacked the mental capacity to execute a legal contract." The morality clause, the $20 million property transfer, all of it will be nullified. He continued his assault, mapping out the destruction with ruthless precision. But I will not stop at the civil court, Odette. I will leak these evaluations to the press tomorrow morning. The Philadelphia business journals will run front-page stories about the delusional, paranoid woman who tried to sabotage her own husband's empire out of spite. They will publish the intimate, fabricated details of her supposed mental collapse. I will turn her legacy into a punchline. Everyone will remember her not as a brilliant investor, but as a tragic, insane liability. The underground garage felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a rapid, frantic rhythm. For the first time since the gala, my composure fractured. I remembered my mother sitting in her bed, her eyes sharp and clear, calculating lease terms while her body failed her. She endured profound physical pain to secure my future. Now, the man who betrayed her was threatening to rewrite her history, painting her as a madwoman to cover his own embezzlement. The extortion was flawless. Richard found the one asset I valued more than the hotel, more than my career, and more than the federal investigation. He found my mother's dignity. If he released those documents, the truth would eventually emerge during a trial. But the damage to her reputation would be immediate and permanent. The internet does not forget sensational headlines. The public remembers the scandal, not the retraction. Richard pulled a second document from the folder. It was a comprehensive settlement agreement. This contract drops your emotional distress lawsuit with prejudice, he instructed. It formally relinquishes your claim to the Keystone ground lease, signing the deed over to my management group permanently. It grants you a nominal cash payout to walk away. He produced his signature Mont Blanc pen, holding it out toward me. The gold trim caught the erratic light overhead. You will sign this right now. If you refuse, I make the phone calls to the journalists before I leave this garage. You lose the building, and you lose your mother's honor. The choice is yours. The conflict hit its absolute emotional floor. I was backed into a corner where my federal authority offered no protection. The Asset Forfeiture Task Force could not help me here. The FBI could arrest Richard next week for wire fraud. But they could not stop him from sending an email to a reporter tonight. I stood in the flickering shadows, staring at the glossy barrel of his expensive pen. I had to make an agonizing decision. Surrender my inheritance to a criminal to protect a memory, or fight him and watch the only person who ever truly loved me be destroyed in the public square. My hands curled into fists at my sides. The silence between us stretched, heavy with the weight of an impossible ultimatum. The humming of the failing fluorescent fixture above us seemed to amplify the crushing weight of Richard's ultimatum. I stared at the settlement agreement in his hand, then at the forged psychiatric evaluations threatening my mother's memory. The physical reality of the underground garage felt suffocating. Richard stood tall, his posture relaxing into a stance of absolute dominance. He had located the chink in my armor and driven a wedge straight into the core of my loyalty. He anticipated a desperate, pleading response. He expected me to shatter. I did not shatter. Years of conducting grueling federal audits taught me how to compartmentalize profound stress. When a hostile suspect attempts to derail an interrogation, you do not engage their aggression. You absorb the impact, stabilize your breathing, and assess the tactical landscape. Richard's threat to leak the fabricated medical records was devastating, but it operated on a tight timeline. He could not release the documents until he confirmed my refusal to surrender. He needed my signature more than he desired to ruin my mother. The threat was his leverage, not his objective. I needed to neutralize the immediate danger while simultaneously accelerating the federal strike. I needed to feed his arrogance. I looked away from the settlement agreement and fixed my gaze on the concrete floor. I let my shoulders slump forward a fraction of an inch. I allowed the tension in my jaw to release, creating the physical manifestation of defeat. "You win," I said quietly. My voice lacked its usual sharp edge, adopting a hollow, resigned tone. Richard's eyes widened slightly, absorbing the sudden capitulation. He studied my face, searching for deception, but the sheer gravity of his extortion tactic convinced him the surrender was genuine. He believed he had successfully crushed my spirit. "I will not sign those documents on the hood of a car in a parking garage," I continued, keeping my eyes averted. "If I am relinquishing the deed and dropping the civil suit, I require the formal presence of a corporate notary to ensure you cannot claim I signed under duress later. I want this finished permanently." Richard smiled. It was a cold, satisfied expression. He ran his thumb along the glossy barrel of his Mont Blanc pen, stroking the gold trim as a tangible symbol of his perceived victory. "That is a wise decision, Odette. You finally understand the reality of your situation." He slid the settlement agreement back into the cream-colored folder, snapping the clasp shut. "I am hosting an emergency board meeting tomorrow afternoon at the Waterford Hotel across town. I expect you to arrive at 2 o'clock sharp. We will finalize the paperwork in front of my legal team and the investor syndicate. You will sign the hotel over, and these tragic evaluations will remain forever sealed in my private archives. Do we understand each other?" "I understand," I whispered. Richard adjusted his overcoat, his confidence entirely restored. He believed he had averted the catastrophe. He thought the shadow lenders would be paid, the hotel secured, and the annoying, estranged daughter permanently removed from his ledger. He turned away and walked toward his luxury sedan parked near the exit ramp. The heavy tires squealed against the pavement as he drove away, leaving me alone under the flickering light. The moment his taillights vanished around the concrete curve, my posture snapped back into alignment. The hollow resignation evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, concentrated adrenaline. The feigned surrender had accomplished its primary objective. I had successfully bought 20 hours of undisturbed operational silence. I did not go up to my apartment. I walked directly back to my car, started the engine, and drove out of the garage. The dramatic irony of the situation was profound. Richard was currently driving back to his sprawling suburban estate, likely pouring a celebratory glass of scotch for Sylvia, convinced he had masterfully outmaneuvered his opponent. He thought I was driving home to weep over my defeat. I was driving straight back to the Federal Plaza. The city streets were empty, the traffic signals blinking yellow in the late-night hours. I reached my office building, bypassed the standard security protocols using my advanced clearance badge, and rode the elevator to the restricted floors. I marched into the white-collar crime division. The regional director was still at his desk, analyzing a separate case file under a harsh desk lamp. I placed the Blackwood Capital dossier onto his desk. The impact of the thick binder sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The suspect escalated his timeline," I reported, my voice vibrating with urgent authority. "Richard Flores is attempting to secure a massive bridge loan tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock at the Waterford Hotel. He intends to use the capital to service the illegal debt held by the unregistered shadow syndicate. Furthermore, he is utilizing forged medical documents to extort the primary landowner into transferring the Keystone deed to his management group to legitimize the collateral." The director sat upright, abandoning his previous task. He pulled the dossier toward him and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the highlighted transaction logs, noting the massive $2.5 million wire transfer to the Blackwood holding account. The evidence was irrefutable. The financial footprint crossed multiple federal thresholds, encompassing wire fraud, illegal racketeering, and gross embezzlement. "We need to freeze the assets before that board meeting concludes," I told him. "If he finalizes the bridge loan and pays the shadow lenders, the money vanishes into the underground economy, and the hotel becomes structurally insolvent." The director picked up his secure telephone. "We are not just freezing the assets, Odette. If he is meeting with a syndicate of legitimate investors tomorrow to solicit funds while hiding an illegal shadow debt, he is committing active, real-time investor fraud. He initiated a conference call with the regional magistrate judge and the tactical raid coordinator. Over the next 4 hours, I sat in the director's office, detailing the exact corporate architecture of Richard's empire to the federal prosecutors. We drafted the emergency asset seizure warrants. We finalized the arrest protocols for Richard, Julian, and Sylvia based on their respective roles in the forgery and embezzlement schemes. The magistrate judge reviewed the data packets remotely. By sunrise, the electronic signatures verified the execution orders. The trap was no longer a simple property default. It was a massive federal snare, armed and waiting for the target to step inside. I left the federal building at noon. I drove back to my apartment, showered, and changed into my sharpest, darkest tailored suit. I pinned my mother's vintage gold pen to my inside pocket. I did not look like a woman preparing to sign a surrender document. I looked like a woman preparing to deliver a verdict. Richard believed he was orchestrating my public humiliation. He assumed I would walk into that boardroom with my head bowed, broken by his cruel extortion. He had no idea that while he slept, I spent the night coordinating with federal agents to dismantle his entire existence. The countdown to 2 o'clock began, and the empire was about to detonate. The drive across Philadelphia to the Waterford Hotel felt remarkably calm. The chaotic, frantic energy that characterized the previous few days had evaporated, replaced by the cold, precise mechanics of an impending federal operation. My phone remained silent on the passenger seat. There were no arrogant texts from Julian or panicked calls from Sylvia. They believed the war was over. They believed the upcoming 2 o'clock meeting was merely a bureaucratic formality, a final victory lap before they secured the bridge loan and buried their crimes forever. I pulled my sedan into the Waterford parking garage and navigated toward the executive elevator bank. As I walked through the sliding glass doors into the polished marble lobby, my eyes scanned the perimeter, looking for the subtle markers of a mobilized raid unit. To the untrained observer, the lobby appeared entirely normal. Bellhops pushed brass luggage carts, businessmen in tailored suits drank espresso near the concierge desk. But a forensic auditor knows how to spot an anomaly in any environment. I noticed the black, unmarked utility vans idling in the restricted loading zones near the service exits. I saw the 3 men wearing standard dark suits sitting in the lounge area, reading newspapers, but never actually turning the pages. Their posture was rigid, their eyes constantly tracking the flow of foot traffic toward the executive suites. They were federal agents, pre-positioned and holding perimeter containment. The hammer was suspended directly above Richard's head, waiting for my signal to fall. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse boardroom. As the car ascended, I mentally reviewed the tactical sequence the regional director established during our pre-dawn briefing. The timing was critical. If the federal agents breached the room too early, Richard's high-priced attorneys could argue he was merely soliciting legal investment capital. We needed to let Richard formally introduce the fraudulent collateral to the private equity syndicate. He needed to physically commit the act of investor fraud on the record before the handcuffs appeared. The elevator doors opened onto a thick, patterned carpet. The corridor leading to the boardroom was lined with expensive abstract art and soft, recessed lighting. I approached the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. 2 of Richard's private security contractors stood guard outside. They recognized me from the Gala incident, their expressions hardening as I drew near. "I am expected," I told them, my voice smooth and devoid of intimidation. One guard checked a digital tablet, verified my name on the clearance list, and pulled the heavy brass handle. The door swung open, revealing the expansive, sunlit boardroom. The space was designed to project absolute wealth and stability. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by 14 high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. Richard sat at the head of the table. He looked revitalized. The haggard, desperate pallor he wore in the underground parking garage was completely gone. He was back in his element, holding court, projecting the illusion of a robust, impenetrable empire. Sylvia sat to his immediate right. Her posture relaxed, her her silver jewelry catching the afternoon light. Julianne occupied the seat next to her, tapping away on a tablet, playing the role of the diligent young executive. The remaining chairs were filled by 7 members of the private equity syndicate. These were the men Richard invited to provide the massive bridge loan. They wore conservative suits, sipping sparkling water, entirely unaware they were negotiating with an insolvent company actively servicing a shadow syndicate debt. Richard paused his presentation as I entered. A collective hush fell over the room. The investors turned their heads, their expressions curious but polite. They did not know who I was, but they recognized the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "Ah, Odette," Richard announced, his voice booming with practiced paternal warmth. "Thank you for joining us. We are just reviewing the preliminary asset structures with our new partners." He gestured toward an empty chair at the far end of the long table, the furthest possible position from the center of power. It was a calculated microaggression, a physical manifestation of my supposed submission. I did not walk to the empty chair. I remained standing near the entrance, ensuring my position kept the heavy double doors clear. Richard cleared his throat, addressing the syndicate. "Gentlemen, this is my daughter. We have experienced some unfortunate internal miscommunications regarding the ground lease of the Keystone Hotel over the past week. However, Odette has graciously agreed to join us today to formally rectify the situation, ensuring the property remains an unencumbered, pristine asset for our future joint ventures." He smiled at me, a tight, artificial expression that conveyed a brutal warning. He tapped the thick, cream-colored folder resting on the table in front of him. It was the same folder he brandished in the parking garage, the one containing the fabricated psychiatric evaluations and the surrender agreement. He believed the threat of destroying my mother's legacy guaranteed my compliance. He thought he possessed total leverage. He thought the decoy civil lawsuit I filed for emotional distress was my only available weapon, and he already crushed it. He was completely blind to the fact that Harrison, following my explicit instructions, filed a notice of voluntary dismissal with the county clerk an hour ago. The trivial civil suit was dead, having served its purpose perfectly as a massive, expensive distraction. "Odette," Richard continued, his tone carrying a sharp, commanding edge, "please take your seat so we can finalize the paperwork and proceed with the investment briefing." I took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying my pulse. I looked at Julian, then at Sylvia, and finally locked eyes with my father. The dramatic irony in the room was palpable, a heavy, invisible weight pressing against the polished mahogany table. They were popping champagne in their minds, celebrating a victory built on a foundation of gasoline and tripwires. I am not here to sit. "Richard," I said. My voice was calm, but the acoustics of the boardroom amplified the quiet authority in my tone. Richard's smile faltered, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking through his polished facade. He gripped the edge of the folder, silently reminding me of the extortion material waiting inside. "We agreed to handle this professionally, Odette. Do not make this difficult." "I am handling it professionally," I replied. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single, unsealed document. I did not pull out a legal motion or a civil complaint. I pulled out a finalized, federally authorized notice of asset seizure. I walked halfway down the length of the table, bypassing the private security guards, and placed the document directly in front of the lead investor. The room plunged into absolute silence. The lead investor, a distinguished man with silver hair, frowned and picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the bold, capitalized federal heading at the top of the page. "What is this?" the investor asked, his voice laced with sudden concern. Richard surged out of his chair, his face flushing crimson. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Security, remove her immediately. She is attempting to disrupt a confidential corporate proceeding." The 2 private guards stepped forward, reaching for my arms. "You cannot remove me, Richard," I stated, turning to face him directly. I raised my voice just enough to ensure every investor in the room heard the next sentence perfectly. Because you no longer possess the legal authority to order anyone off this property. I turned my attention to the syndicate members. Gentlemen, you are currently negotiating a multi-million-dollar capital injection based on fraudulent collateral. The Keystone Group is functionally insolvent. The current CEO, Julian Flores, leveraged the primary asset to an unregistered, illegal shadow lending syndicate known as Blackwood Capital. The management team has actively embezzled over $5 million from operational reserves to service this illicit debt. The boardroom erupted into chaos. The investors pushed their chairs back, abandoning their sparkling waters, their faces registering shock and immediate financial terror. Sylvia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Julian dropped his tablet, the device clattering loudly against the mahogany table. Richard slammed his fist onto the wood. That is a lie. That is a hysterical, fabricated lie from a disgruntled child. He grabbed the cream-colored folder, waving it desperately. She is unstable. Her mother was insane, and she is suffering from the same delusions. I have the medical records to prove it. He played his final card, attempting to execute the extortion right there in front of the investors. He thought revealing the forged psychiatric evaluations would discredit me and save his reputation. He was wrong. The extortion was irrelevant now. I looked at him, my expression devoid of fear. Your medical records are forgeries, Richard, just like the amended ground lease you submitted to the civil court, just like the notary stamp belonging to Arthur Vance, a man who did not receive his commission until 2 years after my mother passed away. Richard froze. The blood drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin a pale, ashen gray. The mention of the notary stamp shattered his final illusion of safety. He realized I did not just discover the shadow debt. I dismantled the precise mechanics of his perjury. He realized the civil lawsuit was a decoy. He realized he was standing in the middle of a burning building. I reached into my inside pocket and withdrew my mother's tarnished gold pen. I held it up, letting the afternoon light catch the metal. I am not here to sign a surrender document, Richard. I am here to execute a federal mandate. I turned toward the heavy double doors. The timing was perfect. The investors had heard the explicit details of the fraud. The fraudulent solicitation was complete. It was time to bring down the hammer. The polished mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, a physical barrier between Richard's crumbling illusions and the cold reality of my presence. The lead investor, a distinguished man with silver hair and a tailored gray suit, held the federal asset seizure notification in his hands. His eyes darted across the legal text, absorbing the dense paragraphs detailing wire fraud, fake notaries, and illicit shadow syndicates. The silence in the penthouse boardroom was profound, heavy with the sudden, suffocating weight of exposed crimes. Richard refused to accept the structural collapse of his environment. He operated under the delusion that volume and intimidation could rewrite facts. He leaned over the table, his face a mask of frantic desperation. He pushed the cream-colored folder toward me. The folder contained the fabricated medical records and the extortionate settlement agreement he forced upon me in the underground garage the night before. He shoved the documents across the polished wood, accompanied by his expensive, limited-edition Mont Blanc pen. The heavy resin pen rolled across the table, stopping inches from my hand. Sign the non-disclosure agreement. Odette, he demanded, his voice cracked, losing its cultivated, booming resonance. He looked wildly at the private equity syndicate, attempting to salvage his credibility. Gentlemen, please ignore her. She is enduring a profound psychological crisis. We are handling her treatment privately. The paperwork she handed you is a symptom of her paranoia. It holds no legal authority. The lead investor did not look at Richard. He kept his eyes fixed on the federal seal at the top of the seizure notification. He was a veteran of the financial sector. He knew the difference between a frivolous civil complaint and a verified federal warrant. He set the paper down on the mahogany surface and slowly buttoned his suit jacket. This document cites an active investigation by the Federal White-Collar Crime Division, the investor stated. His tone was frigid, devoid of the polite camaraderie they shared just minutes prior. It references an unregistered entity named Blackwood Capital. Richard flinched. The name of the shadow syndicate operated like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to formulate a denial, but the words failed to materialize. The lead investor turned to his associates. "Pack your briefcases. We are terminating this negotiation effective immediately. The syndicate will have no further contact with the Keystone Group." The sound of snapping latches and rustling papers filled the room. The 7 investors moved with synchronized, urgent precision. They understood the toxic nature of the room they occupied. Proximity to a federal racketeering investigation is a lethal contagion in the private equity sector. They needed to exit the building before the taint of Richard's embezzlement stained their own portfolios. Sylvia stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She abandoned her posture of relaxed superiority. Her face was pale, her silver jewelry clinking as her hands trembled. She reached out, gesturing toward the departing financiers. "Please, you must understand. This is merely a complex family dispute. Richard is restructuring the management hierarchy. The collateral is secure. We can offer you a premium return rate to compensate for the disruption." The investors ignored her. They bypassed Richard, giving him a wide berth as if he were carrying an infectious disease. They marched toward the heavy double doors, their expensive leather shoes sinking into the patterned carpet. Julian remained frozen in his chair. The tablet he dropped earlier lay dormant on the floor. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a unique brand of terror. He did not care about the departing investors. He cared about the specific name I invoked, Blackwood Capital. Julian knew the shadow lenders did not tolerate federal exposure. By bringing their name into a documented government investigation, I effectively signed his death warrant in the underground economy. He shrank back into his seat, attempting to make himself invisible. Richard watched his financial lifeline walk out the door. The bridge loan was gone. The capital injection required to save the hotel and cover the stolen $5 million evaporated. He was left with an empty room, a broken company, and the irrefutable evidence of his own perjury. He turned his attention back to me. His desperation morphed into a raw, unfiltered fury. He pointed at the settlement agreement resting near my hand. "Sign the paper," he hissed, his voice dropping to a guttural command. "You think you won, Odette? You think scaring off my investors changes the reality of the civil injunction? I still hold the medical records. I will ruin your mother. I will call the press right now. I will burn her legacy to the ground. Sign the settlement." I looked down at the Mont Blanc pen resting on the table. It was a beautiful, ostentatious instrument designed to project wealth and command respect. It cost thousands of dollars, yet Richard used it to sign forged leases, authorize fraudulent wire transfers, and draft lies. It was a tool of deceit, empty of any genuine value. I ignored it. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and retrieved my mother's vintage fountain pen. The tarnished gold casing felt warm and solid against my palm. My mother used this pen to sign the original blind trust. She used it to secure my future while her own time expired. It was an instrument of foresight and enduring truth. I pulled the final signature page of the Federal Asset Seizure Execution Order from my briefcase. I laid it flat on the mahogany table, directly next to Richard's fraudulent settlement agreement. "I am not here to sign away my property," I said. My voice carried to every corner of the room, piercing through Richard's heavy, erratic breathing. "I am here to reclaim it." I uncapped the vintage gold pen. I pressed the nib against the heavy legal parchment. The ink flowed smoothly, tracing my name on the designated federal line. The signature was precise, unwavering, and legally binding. The act of signing the document finalized the transition of power. The emergency injunction Richard purchased with a forged notary stamp was officially overridden by the federal mandate. Richard stared at the fresh ink. The reality of his total defeat fractured his remaining restraint. The polished billionaire persona dissolved entirely, leaving behind a cornered, frantic thug. He slammed both hands onto the table, leaning across the wood. "Security!" he screamed. His voice was raw, echoing violently off the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Get in here right now!" The two private security contractors stationed by the doors stepped into the boardroom. They looked confused, their eyes darting between Richard's furious face and the composed posture I maintained. They were hired to manage unruly guests and escort terminated employees. They were not equipped to handle a corporate coup. "Throw her out," Richard commanded, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "Drag her out of this building and throw her onto the street. She is trespassing." The guards hesitated. They heard the investors mention a federal investigation. They saw the official government seal on the document I just signed. Private contractors operate on risk assessment, and assaulting a federal auditor executing a seizure warrant carried the penalty of federal prison time. "Do your jobs," Sylvia shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "We pay you to protect this facility. Remove her." One guard took a tentative step forward, reaching a hand out in my direction. "Ma'am, you need to leave the premises." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I held my ground at the edge of the mahogany table. I slowly raised my left arm, pulling back the cuff of my blazer to expose my wristwatch. I studied the dial. The second hand ticked past the 12. The synchronized timeline the regional director established during our pre-dawn briefing reached its precise designated mark. I lowered my arm and looked directly into Richard's eyes. "You cannot throw me out, Richard," I replied. My tone was devoid of anger, resting in a state of absolute clinical certainty. "Because you no longer own the building." Richard opened his mouth to issue another frantic command, but the words died in his throat. A strange, heavy vibration resonated through the floorboards of the penthouse suite. It was not the subtle hum of the aging air conditioning units. It was the synchronized, rhythmic thud of heavy tactical boots marching in unison down the carpeted corridor outside. The private security guards turned toward the entrance, their hands dropping away from me. The final layer of Richard's illusion shattered. The decoy was dead, the audit was complete, and the hammer was finally falling. The heavy mahogany double doors did not swing open gracefully. They were pushed wide with the blunt, synchronized force of a federal tactical unit. 5 agents wearing dark windbreakers bearing stark yellow lettering stepped into the penthouse boardroom. Their rubber soles squeaked against the patterned carpet, a harsh, utilitarian sound that shattered the curated acoustics of the executive suite. The 2 private security contractors, hired by Richard to intimidate unruly guests, took one look at the federal badges and immediately stepped backward. They raised their hands at their sides, pressing their spines against the wall to signal total noncompliance with their employer. The lead agent, a tall woman with a severe expression and a clipped radio microphone resting on her shoulder, surveyed the room. Her eyes bypassed me entirely, acknowledging the coordinated execution timeline we established hours earlier. She locked her gaze on the head of the table. "Richard Flores," she announced. Her voice lacked anger. It was procedural, hollow, and unyielding. "You are under arrest." The remaining air evaporated from the room. Julian was the first to break. The arrogance he wore like a shield during his ambush at my federal office dissolved into raw, unadulterated panic. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. He tried to stand, perhaps to run, perhaps to beg, but his knees failed to support his weight. An agent crossed the room in 3 rapid strides, gripping Julian by the shoulder and spinning him around to face the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian stammered, his voice climbing to a high, breathless pitch. "I did not do anything. I am just the CEO on paper. My father handles the accounts. You want my father." He offered Richard to the authorities without a second of hesitation. The loyalty bought with stolen millions vanished the moment federal prison became a tangible reality. The agent ignored the plea. He pulled Julian's arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut over Julianne's custom-tailored suit cuffs echoed across the silent room. The rigid steel pressed tight against the fine Italian wool, a permanent visual representation of his ruined entitlement. Julian began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving against the glass pane. He knew the shadow lenders at Blackwood Capital monitored the news. An arrest for federal fraud meant his protective cover was gone. The criminal syndicate would realize their collateral was seized. Julian was no longer a tech visionary or a hotel executive. He was a liability. Richard remained frozen in his high-backed leather chair. His hands hovered above the polished wood table, mere inches from the fraudulent settlement agreement and the fabricated medical records. He stared at the lead agent, his mind struggling to process the catastrophic failure of his defenses. "This is a misunderstanding," Richard said. His tone was weak, a hollow imitation of his usual commanding resonance. "You do not have jurisdiction here. This is a private corporate dispute. I demand you contact Sterling and Croft. I am not speaking another word without my senior litigators present." The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a folded legal document from her jacket pocket. "Sterling and Croft cannot help you, Mr. Flores. We are executing a federal warrant issued by a magistrate judge. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit perjury." She gestured to two accompanying personnel. They moved to flank Richard, pulling him up from his chair. "Wait!" Richard protested, his composure finally snapping. He planted his feet, trying to resist the physical leverage of the officers. "Look at her!" He twisted his neck, pointing his chin toward me. "She filed a civil lawsuit for emotional distress. She is unstable. This is an extortion attempt. You are acting on false intelligence provided by a disgruntled family member." The lead agent paused, offering Richard a look of profound, clinical pity. "Ms. Flores dismissed her civil lawsuit an hour ago. Our intelligence does not rely on emotional distress claims. It relies on the $5 million you siphoned through ghost corporations in Delaware to service an illicit debt to an unregistered lending syndicate. We also possess the forensic analysis of a notary stamp that chronologically invalidates your emergency court injunction." The words struck Richard with the kinetic force of a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin an unhealthy, translucent gray. The resistance left his muscles. He sagged into the grip of the arresting officers, his eyes wide and vacant. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in his mind, assembling a picture of his own profound gullibility. He looked across the expanse of the mahogany table, past the discarded tablets and the abandoned glasses of sparkling water, and met my gaze. He saw the truth. He realized the loud, highly publicized civil suit was a meticulously engineered smokescreen. He spent the entire week pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into crisis public relations and elite legal retainers, battling a phantom threat in the civil courts. He strutted in front of news cameras, playing the victim, boasting about his impending victory. He was so consumed by the defense of his fragile ego that he left the back door to his financial empire wide open. While he swatted at a decoy, I walked into his vault and handed the ledgers to the United States government. The empire he built on deception, forgery, and stolen land collapsed in a matter of seconds. A sudden movement near the far wall drew the attention of the room. Sylvia, utilizing the chaos of her husband's arrest, crept away from the table. She abandoned her designer handbag and her cellular phone. She moved silently toward a discreet, wood-paneled door designed for catering staff to enter and exit without disturbing executive meetings. She intended to slip down the service elevator, abandoning her husband and her son to the federal authorities, preserving her own freedom to access whatever hidden funds remained. She pushed the brass handle, slipping through the narrow opening. A sharp gasp echoed from the service corridor. The heavy paneled door swung wide open, pushed back into the boardroom by a female tactical officer. Sylvia stumbled backward, her beige trench coat wrinkling, her carefully maintained poise shattering into terrified fragments. The officer gripped Sylvia by the elbow, guiding her back into the bright light of the penthouse suite. Sylvia Flores, the officer stated, producing a secondary set of restraints. You are being detained for questioning regarding your role as a signatory on multiple offshore accounts and shell corporations affiliated with the Keystone Group. Sylvia began to weep, real, unstructured tears ruining her cosmetic veneer. She looked at Richard, her eyes pleading for a rescue he could no longer provide. Richard did not look back at her. The toxic alliance that ordered my removal from the Gala was officially dead, fractured by self-preservation and undeniable guilt. The lead agent recited the Miranda warning, her voice a steady, rhythmic drone that served as the final requiem for the Flores management group. I stood near the entrance, maintaining my posture, observing the scene with the detached precision of a forensic auditor verifying a balanced ledger. I did not smile. I did not offer a parting insult. Gloating is a symptom of insecurity, and I had nothing left to prove. The tactical personnel guided Richard toward the double doors. As they crossed the threshold, the full scope of the social execution became apparent. The private equity investors who attempted to flee the boardroom minutes earlier were bottlenecked in the hallway. Federal agents secured the elevator banks, detaining the financiers temporarily to record their statements as material witnesses to the fraudulent solicitation. The investors stood in a huddled group, clutching their briefcases, watching in stunned silence as Richard Flores, the man who promised them robust returns and unencumbered assets, was marched past them in steel cuffs. Hotel staff, drawn by the commotion, peered around the corners of the corridor. The general manager, the concierge, and the private security contractors witnessed the total destruction of their employer. The optics were absolute and undeniable. There would be no favorable spin in the business journals tomorrow morning. There would be no charity luncheons to repair his image. The man who cared about society optics more than his own daughter was subjected to the most humiliating public downfall imaginable. An agent collected the fabricated medical records and the forged settlement agreement from the table, sliding them into clear, tamper-evident evidence bags. The cream-colored folder, once intended to destroy my mother's legacy, was now a crucial exhibit for a federal perjury conviction. Richard's limited edition Mont Blanc pen rolled off the edge of the mahogany table during the evidence collection. It hit the floor with a dull thud, tumbling across the patterned carpet until it came to rest near the leg of an empty chair. No one stooped to retrieve it. It was abandoned, a useless relic of a dismantled regime. I reached down and picked up my mother's tarnished gold fountain pen. I secured the cap and slid it safely into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer. The federal seizure of the property was complete. The criminal threat was neutralized. The shadows were cleared. I turned my back on the empty boardroom, stepped out into the hallway, and walked toward the elevators, ready to begin the hard work of rebuilding the foundation they tried to destroy. 6 months passed. The harsh Pennsylvania winter surrendered to a mild golden spring. The legal machinery of the federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding certainty, but a forensic paper trail removes the friction of doubt. The criminal proceedings against my former family concluded without the need for a protracted trial. When prosecutors presented the digital ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the sequential impossibility of the notary stamp, the high-priced defense attorneys folded. There were no dramatic courtroom monologues. There was only the quiet, sterile reality of plea agreements. Richard currently resides in a federal holding facility outside of the city, awaiting formal sentencing. The judge revoked his bail due to the severe flight risk posed by his hidden offshore capital. The bespoke suits and country club memberships are gone, replaced by standard-issue institutional clothing. He will likely spend the remainder of his natural life within a concrete cell, stripped of the illusion of control he valued above all else. Sylvia filed for divorce the moment the handcuffs secured her wrists in the penthouse hallway. She attempted to leverage her cooperation for a reduced sentence, but prosecutors do not reward accomplices when they already possess the primary evidence. The federal asset forfeiture protocols seized her jewelry, her luxury vehicles, and her bank accounts to pay restitution to the defrauded investors. She now lives in a modest, rented apartment in a different time zone, navigating the harsh reality of an ordinary existence. Julian avoided federal prison, but his punishment manifested in a different arena. The public nature of the federal raid alerted the shadow lending syndicate to the total collapse of their collateral. Facing imminent retaliation from unregulated creditors, Julian declared immediate personal bankruptcy. The court liquidated his remaining assets. He fled Philadelphia, adopting a transient lifestyle to remain invisible to the predators he invited into his life. His arrogance proved to be the architect of his own exile. The toxic unit shattered, unable to withstand the structural integrity of the truth. I did not attend their preliminary hearings. I had no desire to witness their despair. My focus shifted from demolition to reconstruction. Taking possession of a $20 million commercial property is a legal victory, but operating it requires relentless diligence. When the federal receivership lifted, transferring full authority to my blind trust, I inherited a crime scene. The first few weeks were a relentless exercise in triage. Richard systematically bled the operational reserves dry. The most egregious discovery was the state of the employee pension funds. The management group had suspended employer contributions for over a year to funnel cash toward Julian's shadow debt. Hundreds of hotel employees, the people who cleaned the rooms, cooked the food, and managed the front desk, were inches away from losing their retirement security. I used my background in forensic auditing to trace every misallocated dollar. I secured a legitimate, transparent line of commercial credit based on the unencumbered value of the land itself. I did not use the capital to remodel the penthouse or purchase expensive art for the lobby. I used the funds to backfill the pension accounts, stabilizing the financial future of the staff. I restored the vendor contracts, paid the municipal fines, and brought the building back up to optimal safety codes. I achieved this without abandoning my own career. I did not quit my job at the Federal Plaza to play the role of a hospitality executive. I hired a premier independent management firm to oversee daily operations. They report to me quarterly. I remain the property owner, secure in my own profession, maintaining the boundary between my personal identity and my inheritance. This afternoon, I left my federal office early. I walked through the vibrant, bustling streets of downtown Philadelphia. The air smelled of blooming cherry blossoms and fresh rain. I approached the grand entrance of the hotel. The physical structure remained largely the same, towering over the avenue with its glass and steel facade. But the identity of the building underwent a profound transformation. I stopped on the sidewalk, standing in the exact spot where a private security guard forcibly ejected me 6 months prior. I looked at the front entrance. The old, ostentatious signage bearing the Keystone Group logo was gone. In its place sat a newly commissioned, heavy brass plaque mounted to the marble pillar. The warm, golden afternoon sun hit the polished metal, illuminating the engraved text. The hotel was now named the Elena. It was a quiet, permanent tribute to the brilliant woman who secured the dirt beneath the foundation. Her name now guarded the entrance, a testament to her foresight and enduring strength. Richard tried to paint her as a tragic, delusional liability. Instead, her legacy stood as a towering monument to resilience, outliving the fragile empire he built on lies. I walked through the revolving glass doors into the main lobby. The atmosphere felt lighter, stripped of the oppressive, arrogant tension that defined Richard's tenure. The staff moved with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing their paychecks and pensions were secure. As I crossed the marble floor, a man in a tailored dark suit stepped out from behind the primary security desk. He possessed a broad, imposing frame and a calm, observant demeanor. "Good afternoon, Miss Flores," he said, offering a respectful nod. "The perimeter is secure. Daily logs are uploaded to the management portal." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied. "Keep up the excellent work." Marcus was the same security guard Sylvia ordered to remove me from the Gala on that first night. When I took control of the property, the management firm suggested terminating the existing security personnel. I refused. I reviewed Marcus's employment file. He was a former military police officer, a man who followed orders to feed his family. He did not hurt me that night. He executed a direct command from his employer with the minimum force required. He demonstrated restraint in a volatile situation. When I restructured the staff, I promoted him. Marcus is now the highest-paid head of security in the district. He answers directly to the new management firm. He understands the profound difference between serving a corrupt dictator and protecting a legitimate enterprise. His presence in the lobby represents the ultimate poetic justice. The man hired to enforce my exile is now the loyal guardian of my domain. I bypassed the main lobby and entered the private executive elevator. I did not stop at the penthouse boardroom where the federal raid occurred. I pressed the button for the rooftop access level. The elevator doors opened onto a sprawling, open-air terrace. I walked to the edge of the parapet, placing my hands on the cool stone railing. The Philadelphia skyline stretched out before me, a vast, interconnected grid of glass, steel, and historical architecture. The Schuylkill River wound through the city, reflecting the vibrant colors of the setting sun. I stood alone in the quiet breeze, reflecting on the long, grueling journey. Society often expects victims of familial betrayal to react with loud, chaotic emotion. They expect tears, screaming matches, and public displays of grief. My father relied on that expectation. He assumed my silence indicated weakness. He thought his aggressive posturing would force me into submission. He never understood that true power does not raise its voice. I survived the ultimate betrayal by refusing to play his game. I did not act recklessly. I trusted the unyielding reality of the paper trail. I maintained my clinical composure when the pressure reached its breaking point. I let his own arrogance blind him to the traps I set in the shadows. I weaponized his ego against him, turning his desperate maneuvers into the very evidence required to dismantle his life. My mother told me that glass shatters, but dirt remains. She was right. The flashy, superficial world Richard constructed fell apart the moment it faced legitimate scrutiny. But the foundation, the truth, endured. I took a deep breath of the spring air, feeling a profound, unshakable peace settle into my chest. The war was over. The ledgers were balanced. I looked down at the bustling avenue far below, watching the city move to its own relentless rhythm. I did not just inherit this empire, I protected it. I purged the poison from its veins and restored its integrity. The ground beneath my feet belongs to no one but me. Thank you for listening to this story on Elena Vengeance. If you have ever faced a situation where keeping your composure was your greatest weapon against those who tried to break you, share your experience in the comments below. It takes immense strength to stay quiet while you build your case. If you found value in this journey, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Remember, the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. Stay focused, trust the facts, and never let anyone steal your foundation. Until next time, take care. We spend the majority of our adult lives obsessing over what we will leave behind for our children. We draft wills, purchase life insurance policies, and invest in real estate, believing that financial security is the ultimate metric of successful parenting. We buy into a specific iteration of the American dream that equates love with material provision. But when you strip away the tailored suits, the executive titles, and the penthouse boardrooms, the story of Odette Flores reveals a profound, unyielding truth about family responsibility. The most critical inheritance we pass down is not a trust fund or a corporate portfolio. It is the emotional blueprint our children use to navigate a fractured world. If we look closely at the contrasting fates of Odette and her stepbrother Julian, we do not just see a thriller about corporate fraud. We see a stark, uncompromising mirror reflecting two vastly different philosophies of raising a child. Consider Julian. He was raised in an environment defined by limitless indulgence and a total absence of accountability. Sylvia and Richard provided him with every conceivable luxury. They handed him seed capital for a tech startup he lacked the discipline to run. When he failed, they did not let him experience the natural consequences of his actions. Instead, they shielded him. They laundered money to pay off his illicit debts and handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer, dressing him in the authority he had not earned. In modern American culture, it is remarkably easy for parents to confuse shielding a child with loving them. We want to pave the road for them, removing every obstacle and softening every blow. But when we systematically eliminate consequences, we commit a subtle, devastating form of emotional neglect. Richard and Sylvia hollowed Julian out. They raised a young man whose ego was as fragile as spun glass. He knew how to order people around in a hotel lobby, but he lacked the fundamental emotional awareness to survive true adversity. When the federal authorities breached the boardroom, Julian possessed no internal sanctuary, no moral compass, and no resilience. He crumbled instantly because his parents spent decades building his armor out of paper and lies. Now, look at the legacy left by Odette's mother, Elena. She knew her time was expiring. She understood the ruthless ambition of her husband and the precarious position her daughter would occupy in a blended family structure. Elena did not just leave Odette a piece of valuable commercial dirt. She left her a profound lesson in quiet endurance. Elena demonstrated the highest tier of traditional family responsibility, preparing a child to stand firm when the ground inevitably shakes. She taught Odette that true strength does not require volume, it requires integrity. By establishing the blind trust and the morality clause, Elena imparted a vital message about fairness. She showed Odette that boundaries must be drawn and defended, even against those who share your blood. Raising a child with emotional awareness does not mean encouraging them to broadcast every grievance. It means teaching them to master their internal weather. Odette survived the ultimate betrayal, her father attempting to rewrite her mother's sanity to cover his own crimes, because she possessed the emotional discipline her mother modeled. While Richard and Sylvia raged, panicked, and formulated reckless schemes, Odette relied on the truth. She understood that a pristine conscience is far more valuable than a fragile, stolen empire. This dynamic is especially poignant in the context of the American family. We operate in a society that often celebrates the loudest voice in the room, prioritizing optics over ethics. Families contort themselves to present a perfect holiday photograph while harboring deep, unaddressed resentments. Richard valued the perception of his success over the reality of his character. He was willing to sacrifice his stepson to a federal prison sentence, betray his daughter, and slander his late wife, all to maintain his status at the country club. He represents the dark inversion of the patriarch. Instead of acting as the protector of the family unit, he weaponized his authority, using his dependents as human shields. True parenting, true guidance, requires the courage to be honest, even when the truth is uncomfortable. It requires establishing a standard of fairness that does not waver based on convenience or ego. If a child grows up watching a parent manipulate the truth to serve their own ends, the child learns that loyalty is transactional. But if a child grows up watching a parent honor their commitments, face their failures, and protect the vulnerable, that child inherits a foundation of stone. Elena gave Odette a tarnished gold pen, an instrument of enduring truth. Richard handed Julian a flashy Mont Blanc, an instrument of temporary deceit. When the pressure reached its peak, the flash shattered, and the truth remained. We must ask ourselves what kind of ink we are handing to the next generation. Are we raising children who only know how to thrive when the sun is shining and the bank accounts are full? Or are we raising resilient, emotionally grounded adults who can look a profound injustice in the eye and refuse to surrender their principles? The stories we write with our daily choices become the internal monologues of our children. The story of Odette reclaiming her mother's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of a parent who loved her child enough to prepare her for the storm. It reminds us that justice is not always swift, but when built on a foundation of unyielding truth, it is inevitable. If this reflection resonates with the way you view family, loyalty, and the quiet strength required to navigate betrayal, I invite you to join our community. Follow the channel Elena Vengeance, where we explore the deep, complicated, and often hidden dynamics of human relationships. We share stories that remind us that true power does not roar. It observes, it prepares, and it perseveres. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and become part of a conversation that values integrity over optics. As you go about your day, look around the home you are building. Listen to the quiet conversations, the unspoken rules, and the subtle lessons echoing through your hallways. We are all architects of the future, laying bricks in the minds of the people who will outlive us. Long after the bank accounts are settled and the titles are passed on, the only thing that will echo in the silence is the character we chose to leave behind. Consider the ground you are standing on right now. Is it borrowed, or does it truly belong to you?